Welcome to the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Before we get into our discussion with Rachelle Dene Poth today, I'd like to take just a moment to talk to you about an idea that has sort of been coming up again and again in ClassCast Podcast discussions. This has to do with overthrowing our grading system, right? Upsetting the way we provide feedback and the way students demonstrate their learning. This has to do with how students collaborate and work, whether that be independently or in groups, whether this is project-based or the more traditional assessments. What we need to think about is how students can demonstrate their learning over time. How can students understand that learning doesn't end when an assignment is submitted? How do they know that their education is an ongoing process of growth, not something with a clearly defined starting and stopping point? Well, that first requires a teacher who's focused on growth and who's interested in upsetting the current system to help students refocus on learning as opposed to just simple grades. But this also then requires that teachers have access to tools that support this style of education. And I've been very lucky to come in contact with a company that is doing just that. I strongly recommend you check out spacesedu.com. Their new software, Spaces, is offering an awesome online digital portfolio system that will really allow students and teachers and parents, community members, sort of anyone that we put into the system to collaborate and to provide feedback on students' work. Now, what's really cool is that Spaces essentially allows teachers to create groups, whether it's a whole class, multiple small groups, one-on-one between the student and teacher. You can invite parents into these groups. It's sort of, sky's the limit here. And what it essentially will do is function as an asynchronous breakout room where students can create sort of a gallery, almost like a museum or, an art showing of their work. And people can view it digitally. People can make comments, provide feedback, ask questions, and the student can then respond. Think of this almost as a social media platform in which people can enter and exit private groups, public groups, one-on-one direct communications, etc., but where all of it is focused on providing students the opportunity to both showcase their work and their learning and to allow other people, particularly the teacher, to provide feedback. Because it's portfolio-based, it's not about a starting point and a stopping point. It's not about a grade on a test. It's about giving students the opportunity to demonstrate their growth and their learning to anyone who is in that group, whether it's the teacher, their classmates, their parents, or beyond. So I love this idea, and I think that this is the kind of tool that allows us to take steps in the direction that many of the ClassCast podcast discussions have been taking, which is that we need to reassess our assessment. We need to change our grading. We need to rethink the way that students learn and the way that students can demonstrate that learning. If you are into the idea of portfolios, project-based learning, or allowing for greater collaboration and communication, then again, I strongly recommend you check out spacesedu.com. Now, let's get on with the conversation with Rachelle Dene Poth, in which we discuss virtual reality and implementing great new technology into the classroom. Welcome to the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, we'll be speaking with Rachelle Dene Poth, who is a little bit of a renaissance woman in the field of education. I invited Rachelle to come and speak because I've been looking to have a conversation about how to use XR, VR, in the classroom. So how virtual reality can work in the classroom or will be a tool that we'll be using. So after recording episode 46 with Taylor Freeman of Axon Park, I thought I've got to find someone who really knows what they're doing here, who's done some presentations, because I am very motivated, but very limited in my knowledge. And Rachelle's name kept coming up. And so I really, really appreciate her taking the time to speak today, because she might literally be the busiest person I've talked to on the podcast so far. And that is saying an awful lot. So Rachelle, thank you for joining us and taking the time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Ryan. Thanks for reaching out and asking me. I'm glad to be here with you.
Yeah. You looked busy when I invited, and then after, I started following you on Twitter and stuff. I was like, oh my gosh, you're 5 times busier than I thought, and I already thought you were busy. So you're a very active person. So let's sort of start with your job and what you're doing at work. What is your role now in education?
Yeah, and it's surprising to a lot of people because people often don't realize that I'm actually in the classroom teaching. And so I have been teaching for a while. I stopped at the number of years because I kept losing track of how long I've been there, but I've been at the same school for many years. And over that time, I've taught French is what I actually started teaching. But in the last couple of years, I've been teaching Spanish, all different levels. And then I teach an 8th grade course in STEAM that initially was on how to program hummingbird robots, which I really knew nothing about, and got kind of decent at it, and decent is probably, a compliment. I wasn't really that great at it, but the idea was, to give students a chance and to learn from them and to see where they take it. But then for the last, I think, 4 years, the course I've been teaching is still in STEAM, but it's on emerging technologies, of which AR, VR is a big component of that. So teaching, consulting, doing all things related to education as much as I can.
Yeah, no, it's good. And by the way, for anybody thinking about, wow, she didn't have a number there, that's either being modest or if you stop counting, that means you probably like what you're doing, right? Like I know it's year 15 and I love what I'm doing. Yeah. I know there's a window at the end here, so there's no countdown, and that probably says a lot about your personal motivations. So in your emerging technologies class, how much of that class is sort of learning about, say, artificial intelligence or virtual reality, et cetera, versus how much is actually using it? Like how much is sort of the conceptual abstract versus concrete use for the students?
That's a great question, because we want students to be not just consumers, we want them to be creators. And I think a lot of times, a lot of educators, and I was one of them too, I was only using these types of technologies or teaching about them in the 8th grade STEAM course because I didn't see applicability in my Spanish class, because I thought, what could I do as a Spanish teacher with AI or AR, VR? And so in the 8th grade course, actually we were I'd say probably about a third of the year, we would go to the library to use that space because not all students had devices. And when we were doing that, the students that had study hall that were in my Spanish classes kept saying to me, like, how come we don't get to do any of these cool things in our Spanish class? And I didn't have a good answer
because
at all.
I had Spanish class.
Yeah, I had nothing. And I had never thought about it. And so in my class, I mean, I can't possibly be an expert, and I am not an expert, but I think the idea is just finding something to get started with, because the students learn really fast. And I even said probably last week, I was teaching them about this new app. And I said, I'm telling you right now, by the time I could finish explaining to you where to find things, you've probably, half of you have at least created something and you're already on to the next thing. So in my class, I tend to talk about the concepts, what is AR, what is VR, what's AI, look at some examples, short video clips, and get them really involved in the conversation, but then start with a couple of different tools, depending on the devices they have too. I usually ask them, who has an Android, who has iOS, and then give them a chance to create something on their own. So just in the last probably couple of weeks, I think we've spent, I don't know, maybe a 5-week period so far looking at all of these immersive technologies. And some of it has been maybe one class period might be me demoing something or showing a short video and then talking about it for 5 or 10 minutes and then giving them time to kind of explore and create on their own. So at first it was all me just talking. And then I thought, that's got to be kind of boring, just listening to me talk about it. It's like, just imagine what this looks like or check this out without having the chance to explore. So now they are definitely doing a lot more creating on their own and teaching me.
That's awesome. And it's the kind of thing that you really have to do. I'd had a very basic, experience with virtual reality a few years ago when, I forget, maybe it was Android or Samsung. Somebody came out with like the headset. It was the cardboard box, that goes over your phone kind of thing, and played around and kind of forgot about it. I was like, oh, that's cool someday, thinking very far in the distance. And then, my school division is all online. Like we just started to phase students back in, and as quick as they're in, 2 weeks later, like, nah, never mind. We're online for at least a little bit longer. And, it's going okay. I think it's going well for some students and not well for others, which is what you'd expect. But it hit me that like the social piece, kids with cameras off and whatever. And I don't really pressure that. You're in your house, that's up to you. But I just had this moment where I thought, the technology exists that we could recreate a classroom. Like we could just all pretend like it would look like we're in the classroom. At which point I like had this like, epiphany where I was like, hey, dummy, why would you ever recreate the classroom? Like if you could just hold class anywhere in virtual reality, what would you pick? And that's what got me thinking like, a lot of the things that we're doing right now are working better than probably most people expected, and a lot of this was unimaginable 20 or 25 years ago. And so that's where I'm trying to think, where are we headed, say in 20 or 25 years? And so if you have students who are already working with some of this technology in the classroom now, do you have a VR headset for them to work with? Or is that something like, future grant applications? Because at what point does this become something that's fully hands-on where they can really work with the actual technology available today?
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I did have those it was a Google Cardboard is the ones that I had. Yeah. And I ordered a few. We didn't have a lot of the funding for it. And Plus, you don't know how well it's going to go over with the students, if they're going to like it, and the durability of them. Because I teach in the class I teach, I have 2 different groups, and we're on like a 6-day rotation. So I have students days 1, 2, 3, and then another group 4, 5, 6. And the classes can range from, I think the one year I had 22 students just in the one group, and I think 17 in the other. So that's a lot of hands on. I didn't have enough for all of them. And plus, in terms of cleaning them pre where we are now, cardboard, you can't really wipe that off with like antibacterial wipes. So I did get some additional, like the old, oh my goodness, the Viewmaster they made. They're like the red ones with plastic, more durable. You can clean those. And then Merge has great foam kind of headsets that are really great too. And plus all of those phones where some students were like, my phone doesn't fit in this Google Cardboard. They could fit into that. And then even some, they shipped them and you had to assemble them. And I had not a clue how to put those things together. So I just set them on the students' desks when they came in. And some of them said, how do you even do this? And I said, well, if you can't figure it out, there's no way that I could figure it out. So I did get probably, I think I have about 15, in very low tech. I mean, the Merge, you have to put the phone in, put the app, whatever you're looking at. And that has been something that we use, of course, up until in the spring. I have my own 2 Oculus Go headsets, and I had written a grant and I got 2 for school. But now, as of this month, that is no longer, those apps are no longer being supported with the Oculus Go.
Right.
However, if you want, just the experience, but then again, with hybrid or virtual learning, the students can't really come in and use those like they would a year ago. And what I've been doing with my students, especially ones that have stayed virtual the whole time, is like Merge Cube, for example. I always have one nearby. It's never too far, but the cost of it, or having students to be able to pass that around. So luckily you can print a small one. And then I told the students, if you want to put the app on your phone, a lot of students have headsets. Surprisingly, I was amazed at how many kids actually have their own headsets at home, or we're asking for them, for gifts coming up, that they can actually try some of those things. So we do the best that we can with what's out there. And even if it's not the fully immersive experience, to at least be able to look at something and see, the details, the 360 images, or whatever it is that you're looking at, gives them a different perspective, which is why I tend to bring in some different videos too, for them to see what it's looking like as the person who's actually wearing the headset and using the controllers, and compare, across different types of headsets where it's hands-free, or you're using like mixed reality, you're just moving with your hands, or you have the 2 controllers where there's the wires. So it's not ideal right now, but it's been neat to see how we can kind of problem solve and think, well, how can you try this out? And some kids saying, oh, I can't wait to go home and I have a headset at home, or I don't know if this will work, but I never knew what to look for. Now I have a better idea, and we're learning as we go.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's great. And I love the way you're explaining it, because you're pointing to all these tools that you've gotten access to. And I know a couple of things you're talking about that either aren't crazy expensive, or you could get a grant, you could get at least a couple. But that's maybe one of the exciting things with the Quest 2, the price coming down to $300. Not that it's easy to say get a classroom set, but it's not out of reach for a teacher to be able to get 2 or 3 to use. Obviously, got to wait till sort of post-pandemic when we can share materials and all that. But I really think these things are starting to become more accessible, which I think is really good. Now, you're in a class where you're teaching about it. Have you ever, say, actually used it in your Spanish class or French class, something like that? Like, do you use these technologies now in other places? Because that's what I kept thinking, was like, oh, this would be great to teach kids about, and to let them work on it. And there's like the Unreal Engine, which gives you all these opportunities to program and create your own stuff. And I was like, I'm an English teacher. Like, how could I use these technologies just to teach the English skills? And it hit me that like the possibilities are essentially limitless. The problem is I'm not technologically advanced enough myself to create the tools. So I kind of have to wait for somebody else to make it so that I can come up with a fun idea of how to use it. Have you started applying any of this in content area classes?
Oh yeah. Because after those students were like, why don't we get to use these cool things? And I thought, I don't have an answer to that. And I've been using CoSpaces for at least probably 5 years now. And again, I was only using it in my 8th grade STEAM course, but then at the time it was perfect timing, because when the students asked about using it, CoSpaces created the ability where you could have students work together and collaborate on a project, similar to how you could do with Google Slides. And so it was towards the end of the school year where engagement was, really low, and they had been through standardized tests and AP exams and sports and all of that. And I was looking for a way for them to do a project on narrating past tense in Spanish too, actually, which it's not an easy topic to kind of cover with them. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll have them work on a project talking about their childhood. So I used CoSpaces, and they worked 2 or 3 on a team. And in that, because with the language skills, they were able to upload audio. Some of them chose to sing a song in Spanish using the vocab. Some of them just used the text or speech bubbles to write in Spanish. So again, in English, I mean, you could totally do that. I've had students who learned about CoSpaces in my 8th grade class, and then in their 9th and 10th grade courses where they had to do something like a book report or a book summary, or tell a different ending, for example, in a story, or take a time period that they learned about and write their own story. They use CoSpaces to do that. So it was much more kind of interactive and immersive, that you're seeing the characters, you're kind of looking around the scene. Now, if you go to, I keep saying CoSpaces because that's what we're actually doing now in my 8th grade course. In their gallery, they have, I don't know how many different examples of projects that people have created, and they're broken down into different areas. So you can find STEM and coding related, you can find ELA, where some have taken, and you can actually create your space on a merge cube. And so now you have both of those where you're holding the merge cube, and it's like an interactive story kind of. So you put directions in the student. And now, granted, I'm not an expert of doing all of this, but the students, once they start, they figure it out so quickly. And then you, as the teacher, end up with all of these great resources where the next year, when you're teaching that same book, for example, you can go back and you can share those with your students and say, hey, you want to learn about, like, here's a book intro or book preview, or even a movie trailer or something. Like, you can totally use CoSpaces. And there are a lot of other ones out there that you can have them create. And it doesn't have to be as extensive as that, because there are some that even similar to, like, I'll say to my students, we're going to learn about augmented reality. And they say, we already do that. That's Snapchat. I'm like, no, it's not totally Snapchat. It's a little bit different.
So, I mean, you got the kind of the right idea, that, well, and as you point out, that some of this is going to look different to students today. Mm-hmm. Versus, to teachers who maybe haven't grown up with any of this accessible. Like, I was just having this conversation with a student yesterday that I'm like on the old end of millennial. I'm like the very oldest millennial, I think, is like, depending how you break the numbers. And so I remember going to school without the internet. Mm-hmm. And then I remember getting the internet, not everyone had it. And then all of a sudden everything was on the computer, or online. And so my perspectives on this, I'm like, yeah, okay, I get it. I can learn to use most of these things. But it's not something that I learned when I was really young. And so in that way, like, some of it isn't quite as intuitive maybe to me as to students. I mean, do you think that as, say, like, your students reach, adulthood, some of them become teachers, do you think that's the kind of thing that's going to push this to mainstream? Like, because it was normal to some of them, are we on like a generational thing? We've got to wait 10 or 15 years and this is just going to be everywhere in school? Or are we going to have to wait longer because of accessibility of the technology? Like, I know it's a total guess, but in your eyes, like, how long do you think it is before some of these technologies become more mainstream in public K through 12?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because you tie in the accessibility. And I think that, you have to look for some good things that have come as a result in education of this pandemic, which back in the spring, I kept saying, and even recently I kept saying, it's like the worst, most annoying wake-up call you ever wanted in education. Because in the spring, where schools close and you're like, how do I do this? I never taught online. I know a lot about technology, but it didn't make me like, oh yeah, I'm great to go and teach all my courses online. But now here we are halfway almost through this new school year, and you have teachers embracing technology and using it in ways that they might have said, I'm not going to do that. And now we don't have a choice. And I think because of all of these changes that we've seen and will continue to see, that all of these technologies that maybe, like you said, could be 10 years from now, this might be more common. I think it has sped up the process, because a lot of teachers, I think, are looking to these technologies because you can't go on field trips. You can't take students to kind of explore things, like you normally would. In science classes, for example, like, hey, let's check out the solar system and hold it in our hands, or let's go and explore a place, or even in terms of like guidance counselors that are helping students. And typically students tend to do things like job shadows or career explorations, and they can't really go out and do that. So the next best thing is relying on these 360 experiences or VR experiences that are out there. So I think a lot more educators are pulling these into the classroom. And, I've seen such a growth in the conversations about it. And there are so many choices out there. I mean, it's like thousands of choices. And I think that's definitely going to lead to it becoming more, I don't want to say the norm, but more, what's the way to say it? Like more people will embrace it and see that they can use it in all content areas and grade levels now than maybe did 6 months ago or even last school year, just because of like where we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Trying to find something.
Yeah. And that, I mean, that's me, because I remember I learned about some of this stuff in like an elementary school, like gifted and talented class, but we didn't have access to any of it. They just sort of told you about it. And virtual reality is something that describing it doesn't really work, so I just got the headset, and we had a couple family members who are like, they're all working from home too. And like, all right, we're going to get a small group together at Thanksgiving, because none of us leaves our houses anyway. Mm-hmm. And then my brother-in-law was like, can I try the headset? And I was like, I don't know, man, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And he's like, I'm in your house. I was like, okay, fine. And because I've been trying to describe it to him, and he goes, yeah, that the description didn't match. He's like, I would have never believed what you were telling me if I hadn't tried it. And so I think for some people, it really has to be something you experience. Right. And yet I think this has brought this into a more common educational conversation, that I think more people are thinking about how to use AR and VR. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily happening a lot, but I think the conversation is important. I was really optimistic actually in the spring, like when things shut down. We didn't have any direct instruction for almost a month in my school division. It was like, hey, here's some stuff, post some work, do whatever. And then at that point I was brainstorming, like I was like, well, I don't really have work to do, but I might as well get something. I kept coming up with all these ideas. I'm like, oh, this is great. This is my principal's like, yeah, I love it. And then every time we get something new, like from the superintendent level, I'd be like, oh wait, that doesn't work. And I'd ask him, he's like, yeah, you can't do that anymore. And eventually it got stripped down to just like the most basic sort of little bit of direct instruction, give them some practice, essentially mailing them a packet, but we were online with it. And I was so frustrated. I thought, okay, everybody's trying to make the best of a bad situation. If we do it again next year, it'll get better. And, it's better, but only marginally, And so I really thought that this was going to be a situation that forced the innovation. And as it turns out, I think it's gotten a lot of people talking about it, but I don't necessarily see a lot of this in action. And some of it, it's a confusing time, and there's a lot of moving parts. And so I understand maybe why school leadership might be cautious. But if you already have the concern that, not everyone's getting it, or that some kids are going to struggle, like you don't really have a lot to lose. This is kind of a free run. And I don't know that a lot of people are taking advantage. With thinking about educational technology in general. And so this is broadening out from the VR stuff, but we just adopted Schoology. And I actually did an episode the day after the pandemic was declared and shut down with a friend of mine who's a high up sales exec for Canvas. And so we talked about how everybody was going to need to, start using their LMS if they weren't already. He's been killing it business wise, right? Because everybody's buying it up. And so he and I talk a bunch, and he always badmouths Schoology, but it's mostly just because it's, his competition. But as I was talking with other teachers about starting to use some of these things, they said, oh, well, the kids will just figure it out. It's hard for us because we're older, but the kids will just figure it out. And for some kids, they do. But some of them, they don't. And I keep looking at a lot of the educational software, and especially a lot of the big LMS sort of packages, and they're not as intuitive as as a video game would be. And so I keep thinking, like, you said students can figure out some of these things very quickly, but they're made by people who are making games, who are trying to make this technology accessible. Do you think that we could just do that better in education in general? Like, this is a place where far more than I do. You have a degree in educational technology. Like, why aren't we having game designers make the learning management systems? Like, why is all of this the worst possible database structure ever? When other things are available that kids are learning, like you said, they can just do this. Like, am I wrong about that? Or like, what's the disconnect?
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because I've had a couple of conversations in the last 2 weeks or so with different EdTech startups that are designing game-based learning tools. And it's always interesting to find out, why they decide to start it. And even some of the other companies where nobody was in education and they all were running a business. It had a very like business look or business feel. It didn't connect so much, or it wasn't user friendly for educators for some reason because it was focused on, business. And some of the different conversations that I've had too, it's like they're connecting with educators. They're finding out even from students about, why don't you like this? Or opening up conversations with educators to find out, like, why is this difficult? I mean, you talk about, like, I've never used Schoology. I used Edmodo years ago, and my school was using Blackboard. We had an account, and I looked at it for my purposes as a teacher, and I thought, there's just too much here. You look at, like, sometimes you look at something and it's just like too overwhelming. And so I backed away from it. And it wasn't until then when I got my master's, I had to use Blackboard. I'm like, all right, it's like, I'm going to learn how this works. And I don't know what makes the difference. And the buy-in or the structure of it. And I think maybe just when it comes down to people who are like the game designers, they just want to do, and I don't know, I'm not speaking, I don't have this with any authority, but the reason they're creating and staying in that area is because that's what I guess they're most passionate about, or they are seeing the benefit for educators and for students and feel that value from that, and don't want to maybe necessarily transfer that into another space. I don't know. I don't have
I just think about, no, I don't know. And anyone I've talked to about it, people sort of nod and then like shrug, because I don't know. And maybe I need to talk to someone who's literally hands-on in that field. Yeah. It just seems so strange that we spend so much money on educational technology, and that sometimes the things we're supposed to use most often, your information systems, your learning management systems, are really not intuitive. They're not user friendly. It's not, you think how like video games are set up where it's one simple menu and you pick your options and more menus may pop up after that. But a lot of these you log in and it's just everything's there. And like you said, it's a little overwhelming for the adult, and some of it's overwhelming for the student. And as you said, maybe buy-in's part of it. Like they don't really want to learn it. So they don't, it's not like I'm going to get to play a game at the end of this anyway. I'm just trying to submit my homework. And so, I get that, but we could do so much more with the technology that already exists. Like we don't necessarily have to wait for innovation. We could just do some of these things better. And I think because sometimes it doesn't go well or teachers struggle for all of these reasons, I think it makes adoption of new technology a little slower. Like I think VR is going to hit the classroom later than it should, because people are hesitant because their experiences with some other educational technology hasn't been good. And I don't know that, think of, the 3 or 4 biggest companies that do this. I don't know if they're taking that aspect seriously enough, for the innovative piece. Now, we just mentioned that you have I think, right? I was looking at your website and you have a master's, it's in instructional technology, right?
Yeah.
So you have 9,000 degrees or something. So I always ask everyone on the podcast for just sort of a quick overview of their own educational experiences, on the belief that people who have good or bad experiences through K-12 and after that, that informs a lot of the things that they're going to do in education later in life. So what was your experience as a student, say from your early schooling and then through advanced degrees?
It's funny you ask, because I've written a lot about all of those experiences. And it has changed. As a elementary school, there throughout all of my schooling, there are distinct things that I remember that were either really good for my learning, and I see the value in that, and some of those things that I've tried to carry over into my practice as a teacher. And there are some things that I really didn't like as a student, and I said I would never do that in my classroom. And then there's like other things that are kind of in the middle, just one example. As a language teacher, for me, I took French in high school and I did very well. I think I might have gotten a B one time, and other classes, don't even ask me what some of those grades were, because I did struggle, but I did well in languages. And then when I started teaching French, I was teaching the same way I've been taught. Everything was just the same, like this is how it's done, but then it wasn't working for my students. So then I changed. But when I look back to like elementary school, like little things, just correcting grading in red pen and writing all these comments all over papers. Some of those, just even to this day, when I see red ink, I think about that. And I don't ever like to grade in red ink. Things like asking students questions. Often I would ask a question, and if the student didn't know the answer, you can kind of see their face where they look really uncomfortable, or they're vocal and they say, I don't know, I'm going to get it wrong, pick on somebody else. Then I would always feel bad, like, oh, I don't want to make them feel bad. So okay, I'll come back to you. And then I'd call on somebody else. But then through law school, where my professors, I mean, they use Socratic method, which I didn't know what that was. And this goes back many years now because I started law school in 2003 because I was still teaching full time and then going to law school. But I remember having one night in my contracts class and I studied, I read, I did everything that you needed to do, but I didn't get that whole Socratic method. And the professor asked me a question and I didn't know how to answer him. And for an hour and a half on one night, he just kept asking me the same question and he would not move on until I answered. And when I looked at the clock, I thought, oh, good, the class is going to end until the following Tuesday. Well, at the end of the class, he said, well, we'll pick up with you next Tuesday and maybe you'll have the answer then. And I was like sweating. I didn't want to cry. I felt very uncomfortable. And my friends, I was like, help, but I read the book and I knew the laws and everything, but I couldn't answer at a higher level. Like I was just reading it to memorize the content and the law and whatever it was. And I couldn't apply that. And so the lesson I learned that I now use in my classroom is if one of my students says, well, I don't know, call on somebody else. Like I've told that story. I said, I know what it's like to feel uncomfortable that you don't know the answer. I said, but I have incredible wait time. And I tell the story of the 3 hours spent on me to get one question. Not that I'll spend 3 hours on them, but I also use that to model for them. Like, you're not going to know the answer. You're going to get it wrong. I said, do you have any idea how many mistakes I make in a given day? All the time. Like a couple of weeks ago, I had something wrong on the slide that I showed them on Friday. And like, you kind of look at something sometimes and you think, that just doesn't look right. But then you read it and you convince yourself that it's okay. So then the following Monday, I pulled it back up and I'm going over it. And I went, oh, well, that's wrong. And I said, I hope you didn't write that in ink. And they went, how could you make that mistake, Miss Poth? I said, I don't know. I'm sorry. And it took me like 4 days to realize that. But I think it's good for them to see, and I say, I don't know everything. I'm not a native Spanish speaker. I make mistakes all the time. And so I try to carry some of those lessons learned along the way. And there's a ton of other ones from first grade all the way up through law school, even getting my master's, but I've tried to take what I've learned and what I've thought about those experiences and their impact on me and do something either differently or improve on them in what I do in my own classroom.
That's awesome. Yeah, we're actually in my AP classes right now. We're doing it. Actually, I'm putting a bigger emphasis on it this year because we're online and it's hard to pull off public speaking opportunities. We do like the hot seat, like the Socratic method, where one kid, they make a claim and then for 5 minutes, their classmates just pepper them with questions. And if, depending on how it's going, sometimes I just don't tell them the timer went off. We let it go a little bit longer. And, and some of the kids are really nervous ahead of time. By the time it's done, most of them are like, I'm glad I did that. Some of them are like, I hated that, but I'm glad I did it because I forgot about the public speaking part. I was thinking so hard about how to defend the claim and all this. I said, look, there's a million skills tied in. And, it's a good way to get you guys interacting and doing this. And I said, for any of you, a few of them want to be lawyers. And I'm like, you're going to get this like on steroids later on in your life anyway. So for some of you, you want to sort of get ready for it. Now, in terms of, say, going to law school, what was your motivation there? Was it to do education law, or were you thinking about leaving teaching? Like by the way, backstory is when I finished school, I wanted to be a college professor, and my best English professor, sort of gently talked me out of it. He's just like, you're not going to make any money and it's going to be hard to get a job. And he's like, you can do it, but you could probably teach high school in a nice area and do just as well. And that's what I ended up doing. And then after a year or two, I was very close to going to law school. I just couldn't figure out how I was ever going to pay for it unless I practiced forms of law. I didn't want to, so I didn't do it. But for you, like, what was the motivation to attend law school while you were teaching?
Yeah, it's
bored.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, no, not bored, but let's see here. When I graduated college and I had my degree in teaching French, I couldn't get a job teaching. I was only substituting, and every interview that I went on, they said, you should get another certification. And I tell this story all the time, like everybody recommended that I get my degree, my certification in history. And I said, but I don't see the connection in that. And not that I don't like learning about history, I do, but it wasn't something that I was fully interested in. So I went and decided to get my certification in Spanish. And at the University of Pittsburgh, they also had a program to become a translator. And so I took some courses in that to also count for getting my certification to teach Spanish. And during that time, like, you had to take courses related to business, medical, legal, translation. And I learned so much about all of those different fields and also how much I don't know about our own English language, like naming things. And in that course, one of my teachers was, I think at the time she was some higher, like on the leadership team of John Deere Corporation, I think, and definitely on their legal team, but she had some other position in it. And she was also one of my professors or one of my teachers at Pitt. And I started to think about law and the connection and legal terms and the languages. And then I was reading John Grisham novels, and I was really into like
he was my favorite author. Yeah, that was my first foray into like adult books, like grown-up books. I think in like 4th grade I started reading, 5th grade, and then that was it. Like people hand me books, I'm like, nah, I got John Grisham.
I know, right? And I loved reading his books, and I was really interested in law and those types of shows and movies. And so thought about doing the paralegal program at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, but I wasn't really totally interested in it. And so then I took the law school admission test and got the score. I don't know what that score means. You know, you get those standardized tests, like, what does this mean? Like, am I good? Could I go or not? Yeah. Let it go for a couple of years. Then finally I thought about it again. And I thought, I wonder if I could. So I had to take the test again. And long story short, got the results. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to apply. I didn't tell anybody. I just thought, I want to know if I would be accepted, so that later on in life, I don't think, gee, I wonder if I could have. So I only applied to Duquesne because Pitt, it only had the day program. And I didn't want to quit teaching. I wanted to push myself. I never thought that I really pushed myself enough in my undergrad. And I thought this was my chance to actually try and see, what would happen. And so I got accepted, and I thought, okay, so I'm going to be going to school 4 years, 4 nights a week while teaching. So literally living in school. But I graduated 2006, took the bar, passed. And so that's 14 years ago now, 14 and a half years ago. And I don't believe that I would have stayed in teaching had it not been for my experience as a student in law school. And really? Just for so many different reasons. The main reasons because of that uncomfortable feeling of being grilled in class and knowing what it feels like to struggle to really struggle. Even when you're putting in all that you can, and to still have that feeling, it helped me to better be able to support students and also share with them my own experiences. And then the role of what it means to be a teacher and how important relationships are and being a mentor. So that's kind of, even though I'm not technically practicing, I still keep it up. I still have law school loans for another probably 10 years, but what I took away from it has led me down this other path as an educator. And, what a difference pre-law school till now, how I was teaching, what I'm doing now. I mean, I still have a long way to go, but just so much more than just the law is what I learned. So.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And that was really my motivation for wanting to go to law school, was not that I really wanted to be a lawyer. I'm of the general opinion that law school is the best education your money can buy in a broad sense, even, regardless of other things you might want to specialize in. The problem is if you don't want to practice, it may be very difficult to pay for it. And that was the thing that actually discouraged me. Because I was like, oh, maybe I'll go to grad school for English. And I was like, well, I've already sort of decided I probably don't want to be a professor. And I thought about philosophy, and I was like, there's a lot of weirdos in philosophy, and then American studies, but who does that? Like, there's no jobs in that unless you're going to be a professor again. So, I still occasionally toy with the idea. It's one of those, like, maybe when my kids are older, if I'm not completely broke paying for their stuff, like law school might just be a thing I do for me. But yeah, I mean, I can see a lot of ways that could tie in and help you as a teacher. Now, you used a line in there, and I wrote it down to make sure I got this right. You just said, I was basically, you said I was literally living in school, right? And so because you've had all the normal K through 12 experiences, undergrad, you've graduate school, law school. I'm asking you sort of the big question for this podcast, which is, what would be your ideal school? And I actually ask students this sometimes, and literally no one has ever said, keep it how it is. Now, sometimes the changes are small, and sometimes it's just a complete overhaul. It's, we're going to the forest, or we're doing so, I've heard all kinds of weird stuff here, but as someone who has a lot of experience as a student, and then obviously a lot of experience as a teacher, if you were given total freedom to set up whatever educational institution that you would like to serve young people, what would your ideal school be?
Yeah, that's a big question. As you were asking it, I was thinking of all of these different things. And I think, I don't know, if you would have asked me that a year ago compared to now, I'd be curious what my answer would have been. But I think I really like being in the classroom with the students. I mean, we definitely need to have that time together in that space. in the same physical space whenever we can, so that we can build those relationships and we can learn to get along and have conversations and see, all of the interactions that we have. I mean, that's the one thing that I really miss about not being in my classroom when we were virtual, is I would greet them at the door, even kids that were in my classroom, just that you get to know them and see them and that growth over time. So having that opportunity to be in person in the same space. But I also think that school, it'd be great to continue in like a hybrid model in some sense, or virtual learning, because we need to have those technology skills. And because it does, even though right now it's hard because of all of the things that are happening. And if you are teaching in person and students at home simultaneously, having that virtual component enables you to bring in so many other possibilities for learning for your students and for yourself. And so Ideal School, you have the in-person, you have the virtual. So making sure, of course, the underlying thing is like everybody has access and the right tools and technology that they need first and foremost. But then designs of schools with GimKit, which is one of our favorite game-based learning tools. It was designed by Josh, who at the time he was teaching himself 10th grade, taught himself to code. He was in a public school in, I think, Washington. And they opened up a project-based learning school. And so he went into that school where students still take some of the same core courses, but a bulk of their time is spent finding some type of whatever it is that they want to work on. And for him, it was coding and designing this gaming platform. He had a mentor, and that's what he did. That was like the focus of his learning besides doing these other courses. And I think giving an opportunity for students, whether it's something like project-based learning or having a maker space, giving them some kind of open choice to whatever it is that they want to do. Genius hour, like, hey, Fridays, it's your day, whatever you want to explore, whatever you want to study, whatever you want to learn. But there has to be accountability too. So I kind of want a lot of things. That walk in the forest that you mentioned is not a bad idea either. Go outside and get some air. There's just, I don't know, it's been really interesting for me, especially as a language teacher, because the online, I don't mind it terribly, but being able to really assess my students when there's online translators and there's answer keys to everything that's out there, and giving them some way to really get authentic practice that enables them to do their own work and to make mistakes. But when I'm not in that same space with them and I can't kind of help and support them, or I can't see that, hey, you're using a translator, like, yeah, I miss that. So we definitely need to have that balance of all of those things. But I think having a variety and being open to things that enable us to innovate, or things that take us out of our comfort zone and take some risk. I don't know. I'd say throwing into some big, I don't know, kit or some design of something where you can do a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. And a lot of ideas in there that I think people are already talking about in school. But most of those discussions have to do with how do you apply it in a particular class or in a particular way. Right. And so in the end, I think a lot of times, I make fun of the word authentic in school, not because it's a bad idea, just because, the average teacher hasn't done a lot other than go to school and then become a teacher. And so the teacher's kind of faking whatever they're creating. And then the students are semi-fake with it. I'm like, I think we always should have the word authentic in quotes, but it doesn't have to be like that. I just think that most of the times when we talk about authentic, it's sort of authentic, right? We're trying, but we're still in some sort of contrived setting. Mm-hmm. So some of the things you talked about with choice, or maybe even breaking down the sort of the traditional walls between subject areas, I think interdisciplinary work goes a long way. And I think what we're seeing is that a lot of the stuff like that I'm doing online, students would be doing less work if I could work more directly with a history teacher, mm-hmm. And just like combine it a little bit, because they have to do the reading for history. We could count that as the reading for my class. Like, we can still make that work. But, infrastructure is very difficult in the way they schedule classes. So mm-hmm. I think a lot of the choice stuff is good. Have you ever considered, I'm sure you've presented all over the country and all this, I'm sure you've had opportunities. Have you ever considered teaching in a school that does like all choice, or that, a full PBL school or charters or anything like that? Have you ever considered actually doing that yourself?
No, I haven't. And that's because I've always said that, like, if I left my school, it wouldn't be to go and teach somewhere else. I would be coaching, or I would be doing something different. But I don't know. Now you've got me thinking. I think that would be kind of awesome. But again, with our technology, I guess we could kind of do that, right? Just do it virtually. Travel anywhere.
That was, I've had this idea for, if I did my ideal school, it would kind of function in pre-existing, we could use buildings that are already in the community and things like that. And then it hit me, I always think like, how would I ever get the startup money to actually do it? And then it hit me, I was like, man, if I could just get in with some people who are really good at programming and designing things in VR, I don't have to build the school, at least at first.
Right.
You could essentially run it in a virtual space. And then as funding or space became available, create that sort of hybrid opportunity like you just described. I just think, the idea of if you want to innovate and create it, there needs to be some startup money, and doing at least some of it or all of it online to start makes it easier to begin. I just don't know if that's where you want to stop. Like you said, there is a lot of value in being in person. How do you actually take advantage of those possibilities and opportunities? So, okay. So I know we're going to wrap up here in a little bit, but I want to talk quickly about some of your work in writing. You've published, I believe, 4 books, right?
Yeah.
So you can, and I'll let you sort of talk through each of them quickly if you want, but like what's sort of the through line? What is it that you normally like to write about, or maybe which of the books has been more successful? As a published author, how has that part of your career gone?
Let's see, what is similar through all my books? I'll say that you don't have to read them from cover to cover, which is kind of funny because I have 4, and actually my 5th one is available now, pre-order, which is super exciting. And I don't know.
What's the 5th one called? I might be missing that on my list.
It is True Story: Lessons That One Kid Taught Us, and the official launch date is December 18th. But the first one, they're all unique for different reasons. I mean, the first book you're excited about because it's your first book, and I came up with the idea for, it's, in other words, quotes that push our thinking. It was going to be quotes that push us to rethink education. But then I gathered some different stories and had some people write like guest author or guest chapters as authors. And even 2 of my students contribute to some of my books as well as seniors. And I thought that was awesome to have high school students sharing their experience, one of which was about failure. She wrote the chapter on her own, but the stories, as I was getting them in and looking at the quotes, because it was all centered about quotes, like you take this quote and what does it make you think about, whether that's education or life. But then I read the stories and I thought, this isn't just specific to education. So that's why it's just quotes that push our thinking. And I love it because it's not just my story, it's stories from educators from around the world. And I see the cover and it makes me happy because it's a student that designed the cover. And so that part in and of itself is, I would have never noticed the drawing and the talent of this student had I not gotten away from teaching the way I was taught. So there's all of these things. It's like, oh my gosh.
Is that the one? It's the color. It's a very colorful cat. Is that the one?
It's the cat.
That's cool. It is. It's really cool. It's a really cool cover.
And people thought it was because I have cats that the cat's on the cover. But honestly, I said to this student, like, hey, if I mention these words to you, and I named creativity and curiosity and a couple other things, what would you draw? And the student came back with the drawing for, and I didn't even intend for that to be the cover at the time. It actually just happened by accident. And I thought, I don't really know how I feel about this, but what it represents is, seeing the student and not like, hey, why are you doodling in my class and yelling at them, which is the former self I would have done. I would have said, why are you doodling and not conjugating verbs? So that book I love just because of all the different stories. And then the one that came after that was The Future Is Now, Looking Back to Move Ahead. And it has some guest vignettes in it as well, but it's kind of looking at ourselves, building our own strength, making sure that we're not staying isolated, which I was for many years. I was not doing well as a teacher. I was making mistakes. I was struggling, and I didn't reach out for help. And clearly I know better now. And so how we can take what we're doing for ourselves, work with others, and then how we can help those that we're working with kind of take the lead and move forward. And then the third one is Unconventional Ways to Thrive in EDU. And that cover I actually made by cutting up the first cover. So if you kind of turn it the right way, you can see like the nose of the cat on it. And I like trees. They're very symbolic. So I just cut out the pieces. I put together a tree, but that book has tons of ideas. It's actually great for this time where we're kind of back and forth between in-person, hybrid, and fully virtual ideas. If you want augmented virtual reality, project-based learning, digital citizenship, technology, no technology. So that one I like because anybody who's thinking, I'd like to do AR, VR, but I don't have the time, just go to that chapter and take the ideas and run with it. And then the most recent was the one with ISTE, and it's Essential Skills, a guide for basically preparing students for, I want to say tomorrow's world, but it's like for today, because that's the type of space we're in right now. And again, it has actually some of my 8th grade students were learning about virtual reality last year. And I sat down with them and I asked them what they liked about it. And, they have a little excerpt of what they had shared with me that's in the book, and they have their pictures trying out the VR. And there's some other educators from around the world that shared too, but a lot of different ideas in it. And that's what's become the most important for me is, it's one thing for me to say, this is what I'm doing, this is what's working, or this is what's not working. But when you hear from all of these different voices and experiences and backgrounds, that's what I think is more powerful.
That's great. And you have, a lot of it, I guess, is just sort of using ideas that are available, but maybe not all in one place. Like
right.
You're doing a little bit of like aggregating and then sharing your which is awesome. I think it makes for a book, like you said, that you can sort of pick and choose what you're going to use out of it. And that, I think, for a lot of teacher texts is my preference. When I look at books in education and it's like the whole thing's on the same topic, I've got to start at, I pick 5 pages, I read it, maybe I go back.
Right.
And so having the variety, I think, is a good thing. As a writer, how much time do you put in writing, like regularly? Like you don't write 4 or 5 books by accident. So is writing like a daily thing that you do? I'm thinking as an English teacher and someone who does at least a little writing now, is that a daily thing, or do you sort of work on a project and then stop for a while and then work on a project? Like, what's that process?
It's kind of all of the above. Honestly, the first 3 books that I wrote, I was writing all at the same time. It just so happened that I signed the 3, and I think one was due November 30th, one was December 1st, and the other one I think was December 15th in the same year. So I was staying up till 2 or 3 in the morning, but I joke and say, well, when you get writer's block on one, you just go to the other one and do it. But what was great about it was that I was getting stories from other people to put into it based on the quotes that I had chosen. But I had notebook papers and lists everywhere because I didn't, in my mind, know where I was going to put each story in which book. And then when I realized that I had to actually figure out and go through the stories and edit them and fit them into whatever the chapter was, I thought, why didn't I think this through a little bit better? But I do write every day to some extent, but I don't actually, what saves the time is I don't sit down and write by hand. I don't sit down and just type. A lot of what I do is I'm just talking and let it go into a document or into an email and using the voice to text to do
That's
so
cool.
much. So that's how you accomplish a lot of writing, especially because I do some blogs. I'll go for a walk and have the phone. And if I'm thinking about something I did that day and I want to talk it out to myself, basically, I let it go into the document. Now, of course, when you come back and you look at it, you think, what did I say that sounded like hamburger? Like hamburger and fries. I think one time it was the strangest thing. And then you try and you recognize that eventually, like, it is picking up certain things in your speech pattern, in your sound. So you get used to what it's identifying.
Yeah, you realize that's what I sound like. That doing a podcast, I've never been more aware of all the terrible, annoying things I do talking, because I go back and edit these and try to clean them up, and I'm like, man, if you say one more time in a transition, I'm penalizing myself for it.
I know.
But no, that's a great idea. That's actually how I until the shutdown, that's how I got most of my reading done. For years, it's unfortunate, but most of my reading was work related, and now I have a long commute. I have a long drive. Okay. So I knock out audiobooks. I'm like a book a week, book every 2 weeks. And it's fantastic. That's actually probably the thing I hate most about not going to work is actually not getting the extra reading time. So I have 2 young kids, so it's hard to get quiet time to get the reading done. So, all right. So we're going to wrap up. Is there any other recommendations you want to give? Obviously, we recommended your own books. We talked about those just for fun. Usually do like a couple books or a couple movies at the end of each episode, just for people to check out. You have a favorite book or a couple of movies, and it doesn't have to be education related, just things you might think listeners might enjoy.
Yeah, well, I will recommend, because we started talking about AR VR. I always call her my BFF, but Jamie Donnelly is the expert on AR VR. And I highly recommend that anybody check out. She does a chat every Wednesday night from 9 to 9:30. Although in December, she's doing something different. Every day she's sharing a different AR VR app with a video to show you what it looks like and to get started. But her first book was, and I have it nearby. It's never very far, but Learning Transported. And it is a book for anybody who is looking to get started with AR VR and wants to know about the headsets and how can I use this in my classroom? What are some lesson plan ideas? But her new book is available now. And it is, I just blanked out on the title. It's Immersive Classroom, I think. I just ordered it. But again, if anybody wants to get into the AR/VR, that's a great book. I also am in the process of reading Breaking Bold by Molly and Weston Kieschnick. And Weston's first book, Bold School, I said, why didn't I read this book like 2 years ago? Because there was so much in it, looking at blended learning and bringing technology into the classroom. Teach Like a Pirate is the first book that I read that was related to education after many years. And that book started me on a long journey of reading a lot of books out there. So great books, and definitely recommend checking out EduMatch Publishing, because if anybody's looking for books for children or certain topics, content areas like coding for math, you name it, I think there are like 60 books there. Movies, I haven't seen a movie in a long time. I think the last one was Wonder Woman. And unless something is, this time of the year seems to be replaying a lot of the Christmas Vacation, Home Alone, Star Wars, all of those, all of my favorites. And I don't know.
Awesome. That's great. Again, I appreciate you taking the time. We covered a lot of ground relatively quickly there. Is there anything else? I think we got the books and the rest. Anything else you want to mention, clarify, or promote that we didn't get to before we wrap this thing up?
No, I mean, if anybody wants to ask questions, share ideas, tell me something that you've done that works really well that I could try, I would love to hear it. I'm pretty consistent with all of my social media and blogs and my podcast, where I basically talk to myself and laugh at my own jokes. It's RDENE 915. But no, I think that's about it. I appreciate the conversation today and
great.
The time.
Cool. Yeah, and I'll be sure to link all of the social media and website account, all that stuff on my website when I post up. So this has been the ClassCast Podcast. I'm the host, Ryan Tibbens. We've been talking with Rachelle Dene Poth about her role in education and expanding technology in education. You can find the ClassCast Podcast on all major streaming services, including YouTube, and at www.classcastpodcast.com. Thank you very much, and have a good day.